Okay, so we're now broadcasting to all attendees.
Hey everybody, welcome. We are going to begin in just about 60 seconds, so settle in, and I will have our guests in the room here with me and in the virtual room introduce themselves, and then we will jump into what was quite a exciting, challenging, enraging, frustrating, but at the end of the day, I think such an important reading experience. So give us 60 seconds, and we will, we'll take it from here. Great. And Marianne, for people to talk, do we have the instructions of how they can raise their hand and so forth?
Yes, so you have the option to...
Well, as soon as we start, will you do that, or?
I think Alyssa will be taking
Alyssa's got that?
Yes. So you have the option to enter questions in the chat or in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we will ask you if you'd like to be promoted to a panelist, and that way we'll bring your video up on screen so that you can ask your question to everyone, and that's it.
Our last panelist is, I guess, navigating?
Yes, it looks like she's right out on the street. A bunch of our staff just went to the windows to help navigate.
Okay.
She should be here shortly, but.
Great. All right, folks, give us just one more minute. We've got Jen Daskell from American University joining us in just a second. Really excited to have her.
Okay.
Well, maybe let's start and we'll have her plop in. Just like a book club in your home, or, you know, not everybody arrives at the same time. All right, so welcome, everybody. We've got a couple folks here in the room, and we have about 25 of you remote. So we will look to jump in, and no formality here. When we started this, I guess a year ago, it was because all of us have books piled up on our desks and bedsides that for many of us who are working in tech and data, you know you need to be reading if you're going to keep up with what's going on in the world and the kind of outside information beyond statutes and day-to-day work, and it sometimes just sits there, and so it's fun to be able to have, you know, a deadline and some people to talk to it about. A number of us actually had a in-person version of this that ran for about a year. 12, 15 people geeking enough to actually, you know, get in someone's house or living room or porch. And it was a lot of fun, and like most book clubs, you probably ate and drank more than, and gossiped more than talking about the book, but it became hard to get everybody together, and we always ran into people around the world who were like, oh, that's so fun, but, you know, I don't have enough people in my little neighborhood that would do that, so we said, let's see if it can work virtually, and today with some of the video conferencing stuff, it seems to be working. So I'm going to ask Alyssa to my right, and I'm going to go around and let everybody to introduce themselves. I'll have Jen jump in when she walks in, and then we will jump in. Alyssa, who are you? Why are you here?
I'm Alyssa Benton. I am a policy fellow here at the FPF Privacy Forum.
And a recent
Georgetown law graduate.
Super.
Thank you.
And Madame, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I am Leticia Lewis. I am director of software.org, that is the BSA Foundation. We represent the software industry and other industry, other private sector people interested in the development of technology and in explaining to government, connecting the dots and what technology is all about and what kind of policies that need to be in place. for these technologies to evolve and for people to be able to leverage them.
And you're only at BSA a short while?
No, I have
Oh.
actually, so I am with software.org since January, but I was with BSA, the association, for 5.5 years.
Oh, wow.
So I've been with the BSA family for a while. So BSA, the association, they of course represent the software industry, and we work on many different issues, policy issues, including privacy, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, all these issues that are really relevant to the software business software industry.
Super. And then remotely, joining us from the sidelines of the JP Morgan health thing, where a lot of the people thinking about health and data have been the last couple of days, is my old law school classmate, Lucia Savage. Lucia, a quick
Sure.
introduction. You are at a really interesting health data startup, I guess, that's
Yeah.
doing really interesting.
I'm head of privacy and regulatory at Omada Health. So Omada is a way of delivering healthcare using a platform that connects healthcare professionals with licenses and credentials to people who need care, aka patients. I'm a certified health privacy expert, previously worked in the Obama administration, and here at Omada I have oversight for all things data, our strategies around security, although we have a VP of InfoSec, and also supporting how we use privacy and ethics in our data science program. So I thought this book was perfectly on point.
Well, super. And I'll introduce Jen Daskal, who's a professor at AU, who's been a prominent scholar and writer on data and law enforcement access and so forth. Okay, so, and perfect timing as we speak. Professor Jennifer Daskal has walked into the room and is going to come on over here, and I'm going to let her take off her coat and then turn to her just for a quick introduction, so you all know who she is. Jennifer, I already said you are a professor at American University and a leading scholar writing about privacy and law enforcement access and related issues. Tell us something else.
Sure. I'm a professor at American University. We are launching today a new tech law and security program. So
exciting.
Very exciting, where we're going to be working on a range of related issues, and we have a launch event on February 13th on malicious interference, foreign interference in social media. So we hope you join us for that, and I'm really pleased to be here.
And I guess we're going to talk about the book, but what do you think about the fact that the NSA yesterday, in a maybe novel, or at least well-publicized way, let us know that they had released and shared with Microsoft this big security threat instead of saving it for a potential zero-day release? I guess they've done this before, and they claim they actually release a lot of these. They just don't publicize it the way they did yesterday. Was that a big deal from where you sit?
I mean, what was interesting about it is it's happening at the exact same time that the FBI is demanding that Apple take action to decrypt its phone and provide access in relation to an investigation that's ongoing. And so it was an interesting juxtaposition between the two things happening on the same day. I mean, I think this is exactly the process that should happen. Probably most people know that there's a vulnerability equities process in the government that is designed to assess the relative costs and benefits of holding on to these kinds of vulnerabilities versus sharing them and providing the information that would enable a company to patch them. And so certainly from a privacy and security perspective, the more that's shared, that's helpful in terms of protecting everybody's security and privacy.
Super. Okay. So thank you. Really thoughtful to hear that. Let's turn to the book, and I will try to open and then stay out of the way, because as I saw the reaction to this, obviously a lot of the books that we've looked at in this tech policy, data, and sort of adjacent issues that people who care about privacy and tech and data ought to care about, we've always had something really tightly tied to technology in some way. And when I saw the book and we polled it and it won, and it was called Data Bias, I was sure that most of the focus was going to be the latest ways that algorithms are, ignoring women and being biased and so on and so forth. And when I first started reading, I was like, okay, well, when's it going to turn to that? And I guess,
Yeah, we're just shaking our head, like, we agree.
and although there's a little bit of that, I guess at the end, I kind of realized that if tech and data are how we are intersecting with the world and are sort of the platforms for almost every way we interact, understanding that this isn't just get the algorithms right, but rather there is this giant societal thing, and that as we build tech and use data, we need to understand that almost everything where I might not have even said, wait, let me think about bias here and worry about bias in the code, that this has got nothing to do with sex or gender, actually sort of understanding that this is such a wide and pervasive problem that it needs to be part of, kind of a query for almost anything we do. So I think it was, in the end, an incredibly, fitting book. But I also saw the incredible reaction that significantly women, I don't think anybody reasonable can read this and kind of not, be a bit shaken by how deep and widespread the problem is. But it was incredible to see how many women were saying, like, yes, this is something that, like, there were issue after issue that seemed to resonate. So maybe let me start with Lucia. Was there anything personal that, you said, of course, that is exactly my life. Thank you that somebody has sort of, put this into context. And I see you all reacting like, yeah, there were probably a lot of things. So let me start with Lucia, and then I'll turn to all of you. And then just again, structurally, these are our ringers. They're here. They're people who we know read the book and who are friends and thoughtful. But our goal is to try to include our virtual audience as well as possible. So we're going to sort of kick it off. But feel free to. What do they need to do to raise their hand? If they're using Zoom, they can
send a message in on chat, and then we will reach out and see if you would be willing to join as a panelist and ask your question.
Okay, so if you just want to ask a question or comment or sort of mutter, we'll look at it and we'll read it. But if you're somewhere where you're comfortable going into video, we'll pull you into the room here and you'll join us virtually. So, Lucia, any of the particular issues here that struck home or frankly anything she missed? Because it felt incredibly comprehensive, but I wonder whether just in human experience you might even have others.
My college years were spent at a women's college, so as a theory, nothing in the book surprised me, having studied comparable topics a long time ago. But I think the thing that I was sort of outraged about was the bathrooms. The whole problem of bathrooms, particularly as a public health matter and a public safety matter. And I will tell you a funny story, Jules, actually about NYU. I happened to meet a woman who graduated in like the class of 37, and she had to walk 6 blocks to find a ladies' room because, of course, law students weren't supposed to be female at that time. But I was really struck by the bathrooms because, of course, it's a very simple architectural problem to just build single stalls, even with a urinal, like one person gets to use it at a time. But for whatever reason, we don't do that, and that would improve public health and make women safer, and then we wouldn't have to worry about counting. So that was one. The second thing, I was thinking about this from a sort of a health privacy perspective, and I think it was so many examples there, not just the chapter on health, but really all of them were stories about if you aggregate at the wrong place in the data system to get your answer, you'll get the wrong answer.
Melissa, what about you from the more recent graduate side of the table?
I think I was just struck by the sheer amount of examples there were, and they make sense as you're reading them. You start to think, oh, of course, like, that makes perfect sense. I have noticed this. Of course, I've noticed things like small pockets and large phones and not being able to just use one hand to operate my phone. But some of the things in there I had never even considered. I mean, I learned that men and women have different symptoms for heart attacks, and that's terrifying that I had no idea. Even just from more personal experience, something I don't think was addressed in the book, as I noticed recently, like being on the metro, I can't reach the bars up near the top of the metro. And so when it's crowded, if there's no room for me to get in and hold a more vertical rail, you know, people don't notice that the average woman who's 5'4", I'm around that height, can't reach that high and don't make room. And it's just one part of your daily commute that's such a struggle.
What about you folks?
Can I go first or should I? I think that, again, there were so many examples. This book was really, really eye-opening. As you mentioned, I was expecting to see where is the link between, you know, AI and algorithms and data, but it was so, page after page, so fascinating to see all, and it was she did a great job doing the research for this book. But I think that some of the examples that struck me, one is because I am lucky enough to work, well, I've worked in many different environments, but now I'm very lucky to work in a place that is, we have our CEO is a woman, so we do have a lot of the policies that are in place in our workplace because she's a very thoughtful woman, Victoria Espinal, but also because she's a woman. But so I was reading the example of Sheryl Sandberg when she was at Google and was pregnant and had to walk a long distance to get from her parking space, assigned park space, to where she needed to go. And so it took her being in a senior position to have that policy changed within a big corporation. So it makes you wonder how many people never have a chance to even share the experience, either because they think that they're not going to be heard, or because they are just afraid of losing their jobs. And so that was an issue that struck home and really made me think how lucky I am to work in a place where all these things are taken into account. And even when I worked in places that were led by men, they were very much more aware, I want to say, than the average. So that was one thing that that struck me personally. And another thing, on the health research side of things, it was really interesting to see how the lack of information on human, when they study the human body and other different conditions, everything is based on information that's male. So there are some diseases that are very specific to women, so it's very hard to get diagnosed, and unfortunately that's an example that happened to me. So that is somebody, like one example of a lady explaining that it took 9-10 months for her to be diagnosed, and everybody would tell her, this is all in your head, you're out of your mind, you don't have anything. That exact same situation happened to me. So this is not just an example of somebody who is living way out there. So we are here in the United States when you have all this developed health organizations and scientists, and still in this day and age we come across problems like this. So yes, it's everywhere.
So this is a much more mundane example, but the issue about temperature in rooms, and the temperature in rooms are based on the average male, and just, I mean, always cold, always freezing in the summer when air conditioning just gets blasted, and so just interesting small thing. But I think it relates more broadly to what I thought was some of the best parts of the book was the product design discussions, and relates to your subway example as well, about how many things like the way seatbelts are designed and their effect on safety, piano keys and the ability to be a great musician, and how it relates to hand width, heating and cooling systems we just talked about, equipment design in the military. I mean, there were so many pieces of this that talked about product design being made for the average male, which is a different physical body than the average female.
As the only academic around the table, we think of, academia as being in the forefront of liberal values and so forth. And, clearly she, I think, made the case that when it comes to citations and that sort of thing, there's obviously an issue. But is it your sense that in the university environment, institutions are doing better because you've got, people with independence and tenure and socially oriented views sort of speaking up? Is the university world changing more quickly to be sensitized?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends where you, so I don't think I can speak for the university world writ large. I mean, I think it depends where you sit. So my law school is, the dean of our law school is a woman, the dean of the university is a woman. And I think one of the things that was, there were a lot of things about kind of product design that were really interesting. There were some aspects, she did get into some of the AI and data issues a little bit, but there are other pieces of it that weren't really data problems, that were more bias problems. And it's a way of how communities beget communities. And so I think some of the things that she talked about in here were slightly different than just data bias, but just personal bias. And that, she talked about the example of orchestras. When orchestras did blind auditions, they ended up increasing the number of women in the orchestra. And so that's kind of a hidden bias that people probably didn't realize that they had. And I think you see the same thing everywhere, including in academia. And there's different pockets of academia that are more, there's more women involved, and that often tends to beget more women in that particular discipline. And you see that within different disciplines. You see that even within the law. I mean, there's certain areas where there's more and less women in particular areas. And I think there is that kind of implicit bias and just inclusivity that makes people be attracted and think that it's even an option for them in ways that are quite hidden and hard to diagnose.
Jules, I think that's part of what I took away from it at sort of the 30,000-foot level, which is it's a lot of it is the bias will remain unaddressed if you don't measure at the right part of the system, right? So if you're not measuring the impact of the absence of family-friendly leave policies on your women faculty, you might end up 10 years down the road with a very imbalanced faculty and not actually know why. Similar for health disparities, or even the heart attack symptomology, right? If you're not observing what women experience when they have a heart attack, you won't know you've measured it wrong in the first place. Or people of color, communities of color, where data collection can be both beneficial and harmful. So that to me was the takeaway, is how do you make sure you're looking at the problem from the right angle?
I think she said that heart attack medical indication is, when she learned that was one of the things that was the impetus for the book. And I guess that's the part that I found so hard. I mean, some of it, it's intuitive. You see it, and you appreciate that there's, people have thought a certain way and haven't changed their thinking. But you think of the scientific method where I'm trying to find out and understand what symptoms are of a heart attack and what causes a heart attack. Like you just think that the data query, let's rule out that these people were all taller or healthier or had a particular genetic background, had Eastern European ancestry. I mean, the nature of health inquiry, how is it conceivable that something as rational, right? You can see maybe, some, bros arguing that, well, transportation, we have to help the people get to work, blah, 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 that it's not, arguing that there's some societal logic. But, and even if you disagree, it's hard just to understand how the medical profession, maybe as a healthcare person, as a non-medical scientist, I'm being naive about it, but I thought that their entire job was analyzing and figuring out those things. So I don't know, Lucia, am I being, somebody who lives in the healthcare world?
Well, when I first started learning about this, and I've known about this since before reading this book, I was where you were, Jules, and I'm like, what? But in fact, I think the anecdotes that the author poses, where researchers try to propose research that actually accommodates the biochemical differences that arise in women because of hormones, and are told there isn't really a research problem, and those are confounding factors, so that the research doesn't get funded. That's the hokey pokey, right? That's really what's happening. If you can't get funding for your research, then that research doesn't happen. And I will also say that I first learned about this working on the All of Us research project, but this is not just a problem for women. This is also a problem for people. There are known medications that literally are harmful to African Americans, and they were never tested on African Americans, or maybe they wouldn't have been brought to market, but they're perfectly helpful for Caucasians. So this problem of what is the research group, and is it a group that's testing for a medical drug or a device, or even symptomology, is it really looking at it in a complete realm, is a big problem in healthcare. And it's great to have it highlighted in a book like this, which is going to be read more widely than your average informatics journal.
You know, the downside of having a book that kind of blow up like this is we've always been able to get the author to join us, because we say, well, just, you know, sometimes they come in person, but we say, just video in from where you are, and, you know, we get to ask them some questions. Evidently, this blew up in such a huge way. She's been, you know, speaking and writing and traveling the world, that she's taken some time off, so we couldn't get her. But I read that she was the leader of the effort to get a woman on the British 10-pound note successfully, and that led to an incredible backlash of hate and attacks and threats, you know, really endangering her life. And I wondered what this book, which in a way also challenges, you know, the hierarchy in that way, and especially there are probably people in every one of these sectors, you know, who would be, no, the data doesn't really show that, or there's a good logic for that. And I didn't have a lot of time, but I looked around a little bit, you know, for reviews or, you know, intellectual critique, and I really didn't see that. Maybe I just didn't look far enough, but I got to imagine that there are going to be people debating or questioning this. I don't know if that's, you know, something you guys, you folks have sort of seen or had a, you know, or heard a reaction to. I mean, is this, you know, are these sort of fighting words, or is this just such a documentation of what is clearly in every case there, and what she did is really just pull this together, that you can't really argue, even if you argue some of these cases, you can't really argue the book.
Yes, that's right. I think she did a fantastic job doing the research and pulling it all together. That's just hard to fight. And sometimes the first step to address a problem is to understand that there is a problem, right? So I think that she helped a lot by pulling all this information together in so many different areas. I was very surprised, and again, never thought about it before, on some very well-intentioned policies. Again, that the thought behind it is, if we treat everyone the same, you're going to end up with the same results. Like, couldn't be further from the truth. And some of the examples that they cited on housing complexes and how they were trying to create all these different housing complexes, thinking that they're moving people out of poverty to places where they were going to be better off, and then it was really not the case. Something ended up being much further away from work, so there was no public transportation. The childcare situation was totally impossible to deal with. So all these issues really, they're really eye-opening, because you need to ask the correct questions and not just assume that by having good intentions and trying to treat everyone the same, you're going to end up with the same results. So having women being part of the decision-making process, and also the, I think that she mentioned it many times, just as a woman, and you probably get around many of these problems.
Quick question from Ariana Comsley. For people who are on the phone and not video, if they want to open the line, is there a star or something that they hit? Because
not that I know of. I think that you have to join through your computer.
Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay. One small critique that I did see, she meticulously links, but she doesn't do a lot of, I guess, citations. And I guess one of the issues she had discussed is the fact that, you know, citations are very often, you know, done unfairly, and women don't get cited for the work that they do. And so one critic said, well, it would have been nice, you know, people do want to be cited, you know, certainly in a book like this, it would have been great if instead of, you know, web links where you don't get the citation credit, there had been more of that. I guess that's maybe a quibble, but for maybe the people who like to be cited, a a significant one.
So I have one. This isn't a critique of the book, but it's more of an observation about one of the challenges about writing in the space or just thinking about the space in generally, which is how you describe the inequalities, particularly in things like women's work and how women's work is treated, without kind of reinforcing the expectation that that should be women's work. And this came up last night, actually, in some of the, I don't know how many people here on the phone watched the presidential debate last night, but if you've seen the news today, you probably saw that there was, and there has been, a big kind of kerfuffle between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren about an alleged statement that he made that women can't be elected president. And it led to a kind of a somewhat dramatic moment at the debate last night. And then afterwards, there was I was listening to some of the commentary about it, and the commentary was talking about that, but then some of the commentators that I heard last night and also this morning were talking about, what really mattered were the moments that Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar spoke to women, and the way that they spoke to women was to talk about childcare and to talk about elder care. And so it raises questions about, well, why is that a woman's issue? And why is that, and it is a description of the world that we live in, but how do you describe that world without kind of reinforcing that world? And so that was one of the questions that I was having as I was reading this book. That, and how do you describe women without falling into the trap of essentializing women? So all women are not all the same. So I thought the part she did on data sets and AI and health and product design were absolutely brilliant. Some of the pieces when it moved into saying we need women in politics because women offer a different perspective, as if there's one single woman's perspective, started to make me feel slightly more uncomfortable.
Well,
in some ways. Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, I think that the other thing that there's that, and to me, if you sort of look back at the philosophy, which kind of makes this a powerful book because it's a public, it's a popular book, it's not an esoteric academic, is sameness the same as equality, right? So, and I'm having a little bit of signal trouble, so you'll have to message me if you can't hear, but right, that's the question, right? Do we do things differently because women have these caregiver roles, or do we change who has the caregiver roles?
Right. There was an interesting piece of the book too, where she was talking about standards for the military, where this also came up because it was such a huge. So there's a law case that I teach in my constitutional law class. It's called VMI, where it was a huge moment where the military institute was forced to allow women in under the condition that they met the standards that the men were required to meet in order to get into the academy. And so the big kind of backlash against this was going to lower standards, and the response was, no, it's not going to lower standards. Maybe on average, women might not be as likely to meet some of these physical demanding standards, but there are some, and those women who want to do it, who meet these standards, should be allowed to join the military, or this particular military academy. And so I had a lot of those same questions as to when there should be differences and when that's the appropriate response, or when sameness is the best response as well.
The privacy community, at least the academic and corporate privacy community, has been one that has, I think, done well in having many early senior women, and some have wondered why, and sometimes it's been suggested that, if you're going up in a legal department and the litigators are supposed to have some type of aggressive litigation, and the corporate M&A people, and that the privacy field was one of, you weren't really directly in authority, you were influencing, you were being collaborative, you were being sensitive to rights, and that's why, or it also didn't have a good career path up. You didn't become the general counsel while the M&A and the legal people are. And so people sort of have posited, but whatever, or we just have a lot of, maybe it was just fate, there were just a lot of leading, people, Nuala O'Connor and Harry Pearson, and you can just name dozens even today. The chief privacy officer of Apple, is female. Julie Brill, leading privacy at Microsoft, is female, Lindsay Finch at Salesforce. And I'm really, our staff is 90% female, and we certainly, didn't do anything in particular to say, well, we only want women or mostly women. There just always happened to be great candidates who were women. But I'm always wondering what will happen as this field now really takes off, and the stakes are high, and the money is bigger, and it's, globalized, whether, some of the, people who were going to corporate or litigation or something first may now see this, and whether we'll lose, this sort of leadership mix, or this certainly balanced mix. So definitely some lessons. What lessons for any of us, in a more day-to-day, professional, corporate, I've been sort of thinking about what lesson do I take back for my professional life in terms of managing the organization, or, any other leadership roles? Was there anything that you saw as, okay, I should make sure right, because it wasn't only men who were living in this narrow view that we see reflected here. It was society. It was, many women being part of the decision process, even if they were, weren't the leaders. It's clearly a societal problem in a lot of ways. So were there any things that kind of resonated that any of us ought to be thinking kind of about in a little more careful way? I mean, I sort of took you got to be thinking about it in most new things you do, or any significant things you do, because you just might be surprised to realize some of your assumptions are shaped by sort of this sort of history. But were there any other things that sort of struck home that would, shape how we do a lot of informal product feedback. People are always coming to us with, oh, we want to do this research thing and it's sensitive, so will you, talk us through, or companies have new products. And I sort of felt like, there may have been only a narrow set of places where I was going to be, make sure you credibly have representative groups. And now I sort of feel like, I need to raise that in a much broader way, and at least sort of, question and be sort of assured. Were there any takeaways to your activity that you need to think about or change or act differently?
I think that from my perspective, I don't know if that was necessarily brought up by the book, but definitely a reminder that you shouldn't be taking things for granted, or assuming that we are not creating biases because we're treating everyone the same, or we're using the technology or the tools that tell you that they are very gender neutral. So you always have to have the concerted effort to ask the question, is this really the best way to go about that? Am I including in the decision-making process or research or whatever that may be the correct group of people that represents both men and women and really different parts of society, if you want to get to that result. So I think, to me, the lesson learned is more and more to remind yourself to not go on pilot mode and just assume that things are in a certain way, because more often than not, they're not.
You teach in the classroom. Do you, anything that, changes or that you need to have in mind any differently, do you think, from this, in terms of assuming, I don't know, I assume you already think about things like who to call on and how to make sure that, that's done in some equitable way, or, I don't know, I guess testing processes people have already thought about, but anything that shapes the kind of classroom or colleagues interaction?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just had a conversation. This is not something that was in the book, or if it was, I didn't see it, but just in terms of, there's lots and lots of data about women being willing to speak up, particularly in big classes, and I teach some very big classes. And so a colleague who was very uncomfortable about using, in law schools, we use something called the Socratic method, where we often call on people rather than waiting for them to raise their hand and speak. And it's something I'm a big fan of, partially because I think that's part of being a good lawyer, is having good oral skills and being able to think on your feet and adjust and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. But there's a new teacher who was uncomfortable doing that because there's clearly people who don't want to talk, and you don't want to put people on the spot. And I think for equity reasons, it's a really important thing to do, because what happens is depending on the class dynamic, I've seen this happen a lot, and this professor was saying that this was starting to happen, that only the men were speaking in class. And so the fear of putting somebody on the spot ended up kind of leading to this situation in which women were increasingly silenced because the women were not speaking in class. So I think as teachers, we have an obligation to be mindful of that as well. And I think in terms of organizations in generally, the points that we've already talked about already is the way communities beget communities. And I think that's not just with gender, but with race as well. And there's lots of reasons why the privacy community has been so great to women, but there's also it's a place where people go because they feel comfortable, because they see someone like themselves too. So once that starts, that perpetuates. And I think there was a lot about that in this book that was quite powerful.
Alyssa, we've got some remote folks.
Yes, we have an attendee here who would like to share. Lydia, if you're on the line.
Lydia is muted. Can we unmute her, or?
Yes, speak.
Hold on, we will unmute Lydia. And Lydia, feel free to say a bit who you are, if you would like. This is Lydia Payne Johnson. Hi, Lydia, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Great conversation. Jules, we met years ago. But I'm Lydia Payne Johnson. I'm currently in IT at George Washington University, but I've been a chief privacy officer over the past 20 plus years. And in my note, and I've been a privacy officer at Morgan Stanley, at Freddie Mac, at CIT Group. I was at PwC for a time, and also at Verispan. And so Verispan was a health information management company. And so I did a lot of work around privacy and ethics and the use of that data. So that's a little bit about myself. But my note, I was one of I called the inaugural class of chief privacy officers back in 1999. And as I was listening to Jules speak about, why, why are there so many women? I know at least in the financial services space, that a lot of the early CPOs came out of marketing and advertising. I had been the head of global advertising for Morgan Stanley when I was approached, and they said, we have this new compliance requirement. And it's a little bit of legal and it's a little bit of marketing. You have a law degree, so you're the chief privacy officer. And that was the conversation. And a lot of my peers at that time had similar stories. The CPO out of Merrill Lynch, the CPO from, at the time, Payne Weber, and also at the banks. So it wasn't necessarily that women, the companies had this epiphany about women being chief privacy officers. I think that they looked at the initial privacy notice as a marketing piece, and who better to get that done but the women that were in marketing. Yes, you got a fancy title, but at the same time, the firms really weren't funding. They weren't really. It really wasn't serious, but it did become bigger than a bread box. And I think that a lot of the women did, wind up staying in that space. So I wanted to go, to kind of join the conversation in terms of why there's so many women. And if you know Rena Mears she used to be at Deloitte. Rena actually had done a presentation on this maybe about, I want to say 6 years ago, at one of Larry Poneman's summits. So, and the fact that there were so many women, early chief privacy officers who came out of marketing. I also wanted to make one other comment, because as I'm listening to the discussion about the book, I think that the silent point that's not being made is around the demographics. And, when you talk about health, you know, particularly why, well, if you're analyzing heart attacks, well, why aren't you, you know, saying, well, okay, we should consider women, we should consider men. But I think that, you know, if we could go to the doctor and be, you know, examined blindly, like they used to audition, you know, for orchestras, I think it would be fine. But, you know, somebody walks into, I walk into the doctor's office, they know that I'm an African American. You know, somebody else walks in, you have to give your demographic information. And I do think that the bias does come into that. You know, it's race, it's cultural differences, it's income. So I think what's missing is a lot of around ethical use and ethical standards with respect to, you know, even some of the AI. And you know, there isn't a bright line, unfortunately, which makes this a very powerful and yet a very interesting topic to continue to explore.
Hey, Jules, this
You
is
know,
Lucia. Can I just respond, Lydia? I think you're just spot on. And I think that, you know, what would be really great for the conversation is the same exhaustive compendium, even just on the US in race. Like, where is the data bad? Because we bring our biases to the analysis we choose to do. And the first step to me and the cure for that is for each of us, especially if we're in a position of leadership, is to be aware of the fact that we have bias, kind of just because we grew up in a society that has bias in it. And maybe that's part of human neurological wiring anyway. I don't know, I haven't read enough brain science, but that's exactly right, is you're not gonna learn to recognize it and then therefore to address it if you don't acknowledge that it exists in the first place.
Yeah, and I guess there have been a couple of well-received recent books that focus on data and race and data and poverty, the poverty of privacy rights, and a few others. I think we even had one of the books we were polling for this event. Thank you, useful thoughts. Did David, were we going to read his comment or bring him in? Is it David Saleh?
So Jules, I can, if we're not going to bring him in audibly, I read his comment and I can address a little bit about that.
Well, let's check. Are we bringing David in, or are we? Okay, so why don't we, Lucia, let me ask you to share David's comment,
Sure.
and then yes, we'll just jump in.
So David, I'm gonna try and condense it a little bit, but essentially he's saying, are there examples where there are privacy implications of collecting sex-specific data were more concerning from a privacy perspective? For example, he writes, for example, I think seeing more opinions from women on the size of cell phones likely has low risk compared to if we were to start tracking women's movement throughout the public transportation system in order to better understand their caretaking patterns. Which data could be risky and how would you go about mitigating those risks? And so in answer, I would say, I think David is really raising the issue that we in healthcare grapple with all the time relative to what is called social determinants of health. So those are all the things outside of the actual presenting physical or mental ailment that impact your health. It could be where you live and the caliber of the air and how much time you have to spend on public transportation, or what fresh fruits and vegetables are available to you, and do you live in all kind, rural or urban, all those things. And I personally I understand why those things are super important to understand where the healthcare system isn't working, and in this example, where the transportation system isn't working. But I am a personal fan of actually asking the people instead of collecting the data surreptitiously. So if I were, as a privacy officer, were presented with this particular problem, my advice would be set up a way from an anthropologist or sociologist perspective to interview women about their transportation patterns instead of, for example, using bus cams to figure out which women were going on serial bus trips and which ones weren't. Because I think that's the dignitary respect, is to not have people observing you when you don't expect to be observed.
So let me engage you on that, because I was thinking of the same problem, but I wonder whether, great, government, go ahead, do a big survey, Apple, do a big survey, big companies do the work to sample and so forth. But for a vast number of other players who might previously have been, because they just wanted the data or were interested, been asking male, female, income, whatever, just in their course of collecting information, and who now, because of privacy law, need to minimize, need to say, am I really justified in collecting that? And I'd argue you might be justified, and if you're a sophisticated player, you will ask for that information and you will have your justification that you need it to ensure that there isn't bias and so forth. But the small and medium enterprises of the world are just being told, it's complicated to collect data, you need a legal basis, you've got to do a privacy impact test, you've got to do a balancing. If it's sensitive, the risk is even higher, you could have to have separate consent. And that if they actually don't really need it, which they really do need it if it's going to be querying some of what we want, they're not going to be asking for it. And I'm seeing, and again, from a privacy point of view, it's got some good to it. Many people getting the message of don't collect things you don't need, because data means risk. You need a retention plan. And so I wonder whether we're going to have less data that might actually be useful to expose bias. We see it in, say, the school system, where, advocates who are concerned about privacy are worried about discipline information, right? You're creating a permanent record that is going to be, this kid was disciplined and it'll be used against them. That was one of the whole goals of FERPA, that police were accessing information that the parents didn't even know existed, and so we give them these rights. But then I think of that study that tried to understand why are there so few African American boys applying to college, let alone going into college, and they were able to trace back that one of the really negative effects were that these kids were being over-disciplined at very junior ages, and that created this sort of cascading, hey, this was the kids. And so, that data wasn't there. Nobody opted into it. It's 20-year-old information, but there is value, I'd argue, as someone who's sort of optimistic about data, that you're going to need some of these things to find bias in the data set. So I guess at the end of the day, it's getting the right balance.
I have an answer to that. It's a really old answer, but if anyone on the phone has lived in California as long as I have, you'll know that we have our proposition system. And I'm going to say it was about 20 years ago, but we had a proposition that was proposing to outlaw the collection of data on race and ethnicity that was used to evaluate how fairly government services were handed out. And what actually happened politically was the community organizations whose people benefited from the fact that data was collected and could show that they weren't getting services organized themselves to fight the proposed law. And so what I think that teaches us in this example of the buses, or in your example of school disciplinary records, is bring the people into the conversation about whom you need to collect data and have them embrace your hypothesis. If you need to collect data about who's using buses so you can push more ride-hailing app ads to them, that's one thing. And if you need to collect that data so that you can re-engineer the bus lines as a public good for the population that primarily uses them, that's a different thing entirely. And so that's about a dialogue with the impacted communities about your hypothesis.
Yeah. Look, I think you're exactly right. We've done some work helping some of the academic evidence-based policy community who want to do things like, are homeless people ending up in an emergency room? Is it alcohol? Is it mental illness? Is it losing, a home? Which expenditures of money are working? Are people in jobs? Are they in housing? That data is all there, but linking it together obviously can create all kinds of challenges. And if you can't get permission, what are the other things you can do? Engaging the organizations that represent people, engaging community, to show that you're considering ethics, that you've got social license. You're not just deciding this is good for you to know about them, but that this is truly something that is going to help and not harm the community in some unintended way. So I think you're exactly right. Whether the trade-off of some of these smaller players just not having the data matters, maybe that's more risk because you got these little apps collecting all this data, most of them are not doing it because they want to help worry about bias, and maybe it is just creating more advertising and marketing and misuse. And maybe the number of cases I'm thinking about are limited, but I guess that's the challenge.
And I guess that, to your point, a lot of the book talks about that all the time, that a lot of the data that's collected is all aggregated, right? And sometimes it's not that you don't have the data, you just don't know what data refers to men and what data refers to women. So you go a step ahead, because I think that one thing that people use to protect themselves, if you ever conduct a survey, the first thing you say is like, oh, all the data is going to be analyzed on the aggregate. So that's definitely based on what's here in the book, not what you need in order to correct the problem. So,
Melissa?
I think one of the striking things to me, though, is just what do you do to fix these issues? Because it can't just be as simple as now we collect sex disaggregated data. Why weren't we doing that already then, if we knew that that was an issue in different sectors? So how do you move forward from that?
Well, I guess this book does a lot, at least to raise the awareness. I'm glad it got such a wide distribution, and maybe we all got to figure out where it makes a difference in our lives. I was talking to my 16-year-old daughter as I drove her to school, and I was, looking to find an example that would resonate with her, because I think, there's a generation that's sort of growing up without some of or at least they haven't yet run into some of the, the boundaries, and they don't yet see the inequities. And so, I was trying to, get her interested. She just wanted to update her morning Snapchat. But, she's acutely aware of, how we commute, and how, her mom, who teaches, locally and, does a lot more of the regional getting around, and I'm doing more of the downtown and back, and how, our nanny, has this incredibly challenging commute because she's coming around the metro area in a way that the metro hasn't been, built, and so it just takes her so much longer. And, I think that was sort of helpful, but I'm always wondering whether, the generation growing up with a little bit more of a progressive thing is going to be taking these issues, differently, or solving them in different ways. Anyway, any final thoughts from anybody remote? Here's a comment from Teresa. Alyssa, can you read it a little closer?
Yeah. Teresa said, hello everyone, big data is big business, which is troublesome in the world of data privacy and data aggregation. A diverse set of women must always be at the table to provide guidance, awareness, and communication.
And then another comment?
Viv said, my biggest realization is that we as women and as a society shouldn't look at the gender gap issue as a need to push for equality, since equality doesn't fix the issues like the bathroom line, parking spaces, etc. Pushing for equality seems to be the wrong approach in terms of achieving the results we need as addressed in this book. We should be pushing a new thought process to not treat women as a subset, atypical species of men, and to treat each as its own separate set of unique characteristics and makeup. This book is a good step to recognizing issues, but doesn't offer a lot of solutions. Part of the problem may be that it's not enough people care to start fixing this gap. A big part is probably just lack of awareness.
Yeah, and this goes to your question too about solutions. I think that what this book does is and you said this already, but this is the first step, and we need to understand the problem before we go to the solution. And the solution's not the same across the board. There's different solutions for different kinds of problem sets, and same to your data question as well, whether or not you need the data in a particular situation to address the problem depends on the particular problem. And so I think what this book does an amazing job of is laying out the problem and laying out the invisibility of women, in particular women's bodies and health characteristics in a range of different areas, and that hopefully triggers what ends up being sector-specific solutions.
I guess there is a big message, though. She does seem to be saying, get the data, because, it'll be obvious that you ought to be acting on it if you actually have the data. I did take it as sort of a, data is a big way to start exposing this.
No, I agree with that. I think I was reacting more to, in some cases, the way to do that is just having conversations with people, and some of it is actually gathering data in the kinds of, that raise the kind of privacy considerations that you were raising, particularly in light of new privacy legislation. So there's different ways of getting that data and what data you need, and how extensive that data needs to be, and from whom will vary, I think, depending on the particular problem set that you're dealing with.
Well, I thank you all for joining here in the room, and we had about 35 remotely, thanks to those of you who actually took time in the middle of a busy day, and Lucia from joining us remotely. If there's a book on your shelf that you're waiting to read, please ping us. We'll put it in our poll for the next. Do we have a date already set? I don't know if we do.
No.
Okay, we'll probably set a date in about 2 months or so after we choose the book, to give you all time to read. So if there's anything you want to get, we maybe go further in this direction with or something completely different. Thanks for joining us, and have a good day. Thank you all. Bye. Thanks for coming in. Bye, everybody.